Red Steel was a first-person shooter released for the Wii in 2006. The game was built using a modified version of Unreal Engine 2.5 and promised a unique mix of precise gunplay and engaging first-person sword combat, something that only the Wii at the time could actually deliver. Being a launch title, there was a lot riding on Red Steel. Not only was it the first third-party game announced for the system, but it was also a Wii exclusive that promised a whole new gameplay experience due to its use of motion controls. Unfortunately, Red Steel never quite delivered on those promises, and was met with rather polarizing opinions from both the press and the gaming community at large. I openly admit I missed this game at launch and only recently picked it up out of curiosity. When I finally got to pop it into my Wii U system, alarm bells went off immediately as I was confused by the bizarre UI choices made for the main menu screen. Things didn't improve much once the game started. I was greeted with a cheap-looking comic-style cutscene and then dropped into a room where I was asked to look at fish. This served as a tutorial on how the motion controls worked, but it was hardly engaging and immediately set in stone just how awkward the controls would be throughout the rest of the experience. Not long after that, someone important died and the shooting began. 10 minutes later, I had turned off my console. It had been a long time since I'd been so frustrated so quickly by a game. It wasn't until a few days later, when I tried the game again, determined to get my $10 worth out of it, that things finally started to click. You take control of Scott, an American bodyguard whose fiancée Miyu is taken by the Yakuza because they want her daddy's sword, the Katana-giri, for revenge or something. I don't really know exactly. The story was simple and all, but it was confusing due to the way it was told. To be fair, story really isn't all that important in a game like this anyway. All you really need to know is that your fiancé is gone and it's up to you to travel from LA to Tokyo and to shoot everyone to get her back. Everything else is simply filler with some poor attempts at drama and double-crossing thrown in there for good measure. Once you get your hands on your first weapon, you'll probably feel like something is wrong. It all makes sense in theory. The reticule of the Wiimote aims, and that works fine for the most part. The Z trigger fires your gun, which actually feels pretty good. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the actual act of firing your gun in this game is actually quite satisfying, with some nice kickback and some solid sound effects. You can reload by either flicking your nunchuck down or by pressing right on the D-pad. Both options work, but I found the nunchuck method to be a little inconsistent since you also flick down on the nunchuck to pick up weapons, which sometimes leads to you picking up a weapon when you're just trying to reload. You can also press right on the D-pad to reload, but it's a little out of the way when you're in the middle of a gunfight. To change weapons, you simply hit left on the D-pad, which, once again, in the heat of combat, is a little out of the way. All in all, it's not a perfect system, but it works well enough. Where things really start to fall apart is the additional motion controls. Do you want to zoom in on someone to get a headshot? Hold down the A button and push your Wiimote forward. Do you want to throw a grenade? Hold down on the D-pad as well as the jump button while making a throwing or rolling gesture with the nunchuck. Do you want to slow down time? The process to get this to work is so complex I had already forgotten how to do it by the time I'd left the tutorial. All in all, the game has some rather fun firefights, and I did actually find myself enjoying the game at times when the level design allowed me to. The other big part of the game was of course the one-on-one katana duels. Once again, on paper, these seem like a great idea. The idea of swapping from a gun to a sword and back again does sound like, and by all rights, should be a lot of fun, and that's what the promise of the Wiimote was all about. But that's not how things worked out in Red Steel. Instead, you'll be happily mowing down waves of Yakuza, only to walk into a room, you'll see a man with a sword walk in, and you'll watch as your character puts away his gun to pull his sword out. I understand that this is to keep that whole Japanese vibe, you know, with like honor and all that jazz, but all it really does is break the pace of the game. To make matters worse, the sword fights themselves aren't dynamic. Instead, they play out like puzzles. Some of the time you can just wave your arm about like an idiot, and win without getting hit once. Other times you just need to keep dodging to the side and then attacking once or twice before going back to dodging again. I think the idea of a more puzzle-based sword fight is fine, especially seeing as how the Wii at the time couldn't recognize one-to-one motion, but having to just recycle the same cheap trick over and over again to win just ruins the whole experience. The sword fights also have these invisible boundaries around them, and when you get too close to them, a short cutscene will initiate where you move back into the center of the room. I can't even tell you how many times I had almost won a fight only to have the cutscene happen just before I could inflict the final blow. Or that the AI would immediately attack me after the cutscene, leaving me with very little time to block or dodge. It's just cheap and it's not a lot of fun. Another one of the big issues is the game's visuals. Now I'm not going to knock the graphics on a technical level on a game like this. It was a launch game on the Wii, a system that was always going to be underpowered. The character models are fine and the guns all look nice. Rather, I was constantly confused by the inconsistency in the game's visuals. Some areas look like they were straight out of a Nintendo 64 game, while others actually look rather nice. Of course, there's nothing groundbreaking here, but I was surprised to see little effects like flames on stovetops and destructible environments, moths flying around lanterns. The game is full of these sorts of little touches and I really appreciate them. Seeing light beam down through the airport hangar's ceiling while steam distorts the air in the vents below. Aeroplanes fly overhead of the skyscrapers in Tokyo while mist and fog seeps through the bamboo in the villain's gardens. But then there are areas like this beach. Yeah, this is the same game. There's also this trend of having empty environments. There's this bustling street here, which is empty. And there's also this strip club, which is empty. Nothing ever really feels alive in this game because there's no real NPCs or people living their day-to-day lives. It's a very small thing, but it has a massive impact on the environments and the atmosphere of the game. It's these sorts of inconsistencies that I really feel are distracting and really pull me out of the game. This also leads me to the pacing. The game is split up over 3 acts, with the first act taking place in LA, and the second and third acts taking place in Tokyo. I actually really like the pacing in the first act. It's really good with each stage flowing from one into the next. But when the second act hits, everything comes to a grinding halt. In this act you need to talk to a number of Yakuza bosses and do a task for each of them. What makes this whole sequence jarring is the fact that you can do them in any order, and it has absolutely no impact on the gameplay or the story. You don't even know what each mission entails until you've started it. It's just sort of an option that's there. What's more, these stages have an issue that none of the other stages in the first act seem to suffer from, and that's bad checkpoint placement. Almost all of the checkpoints in the second act are placed before a large gunfight, which are followed by a sword fight. Or sometimes, a sword fight which is followed by a large gunfight. This means if you die, you'll be replaying a lot of the same parts of the game over and over. Worse still, the cutscenes are unskippable, which only drags the experience out more. I'm not saying that the game needs a checkpoint after every gun or sword fight, but I think that there's no excuse in any game to not have a checkpoint immediately after a cutscene, especially when that cutscene happens to be unskippable. Lastly, I'd like to get back to my earlier comments on level design. Overall, I actually really like the level design in this game. There's a lot of personality and I don't find it particularly monotonous, which I do find happens a lot in other shooters for me. Unfortunately, many of the levels don't accommodate for what many, including myself, would consider to be the game's biggest flaw. That would be the bounding box for turning. Unlike most games where you turn by moving the reticule, Red Steel forces you to actually push your view around by moving the reticule to the edge of the screen and literally pushing it to the side. It's cumbersome, it's clunky, and worst of all, it's slow. This can make gunfights in tight areas feel like an absolute chore as you're constantly having to stop shooting to turn and then you need to regain your bearings. Stairwells are the epitome of the flaw in this design choice. In more open environments, it actually works quite well. Strafing from left to right while shooting everything that moves actually feels pretty good. Almost like you're playing a light gun game. But I don't personally feel like the sacrifice of mobility and speed was worth it just for those sequences, as they're too few and far between. By this point, you must think I hate the game. But I have to admit, despite all of the game's flaws, I still somehow managed to enjoy it. And there are even some real positives in amongst all the negatives that I think are worth mentioning. First of all is the music composed by Tom Salter. It's fantastic. There's this great mix of electro, dance, traditional oriental music, and fusions of all of these things. There's some really great tracks hidden within this game, and I honestly think it has one of the best soundtracks on the Wii. The other big thing that I really enjoyed about this game was just how clever and fresh some of the set pieces felt. Every shooter now seems to feel the need to have a bunch of massive set piece moments. Often though, I find that they all seem to blend together, or they end up being just so ridiculous that they're forgettable. Somehow, Red Steel set pieces seem to stick in my mind more, not because of how elaborate or excessive they were, but because of how simple and subtle they were. Moments such as fighting in a fish market as bits of tuna explode as men take cover behind them, trying to avoid snipers as you make your way through a Zen garden on top of a bank, or even sword fighting on the tarmac of an airport as you try to stop a plane from taking off are all memorable for me. Not because they're over the top, but because of their simplicity. Red Steel is absolutely full of these moments, and despite all of its issues, or perhaps because of its issues, these moments never stopped catching me off guard, and I actually found them to be really refreshing. And I guess, in the end, that's probably what I'll really remember Red Steel for. It's a troubled game, with negatives that far outweigh the positives. But when it's fun, it's really fun. Surprisingly fun. And it almost makes me feel like I'm a kid again playing GoldenEye or Perfect Dark. Despite all of its negatives, I still suggest giving this game a go. It's cheap as dirt now and incredibly easy to get your hands on. just make sure you go in with the right mindset when you sit down to play it. There's a good time to be had here. You just kind of need to reset your brain and what you expect from a shooter to find it.
Hey, man. When they told me I'd see some action in this place, I thought they just meant with the girls.
Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, you can always like and subscribe, or let us know in the comments below what you'd like to see. If you want some more content, we have more on the way, but in the meantime, me and Jessica both have our own Let's Play channels that you can see over on the right there. Be sure to check those out if you're into that sort of thing, and hopefully we'll see you next time.